My wife had an affair and was defrauded by her lover. I left her to handle the debt on her own. I'm writing this in an attempt to finally move on from everything. Even though I'm 33 years old, my ex-wife, who is 3 years younger than me, still makes an effort to get involved in my life whenever she can. We will refer to her as Darcy. This is how I'm putting it out there for good because I'm over it. I want to go ahead and request her restraining order from the court as soon as this is posted. All I need to do is move on and stop her from attempting to pursue me and reappear whenever she feels like it. While working remotely on a branding project a few years ago, Darcy and I got to know one another. I ended up DMing her to deliver her the completed design I had created for her because it was my responsibility to create profiles for all parties. She was really kind from the beginning, loved it, and gave me great feedback on my work. Naturally, we continued our conversation. Then, one day, she unexpectedly phones to tell me that she has to meet up since she is traveling to my city for work. I was inquisitive, but I wasn't really anticipating anything significant because I was single at the time. She seemed pretty in her photos, so I thought it would be good to finally meet her in person. Although I wasn't specifically aiming for a relationship, I wouldn't have been unhappy if it had happened. She had chosen a restaurant, and her chats with Darcy were as cordial and amiable as their direct messages. We began dating shortly after that. It just occurred. I asked her to be my girlfriend on one of those lovely evenings while she was in town. We became formal as soon as she said yes. We made the decision to be married after a little more than a year of dating. I should also mention that I was disliked by her family, particularly by her mother and her sisters. In many ways, they demonstrated to me that I was too impoverished for their daughter. Yet they still went ahead and were married. Somehow, these individuals believed they were superior to me even though their socioeconomic level was just slightly higher than mine. Things were doing well financially. I was still working as a designer, but I had secured a better paying job, and Darcy had relocated to my city permanently. Additionally, as we worked in the same field, we constantly connected with one another on projects whenever we could. The happiest period of our married lives was when we finally had a kid, even if it took a long. For almost 5 months, Darcy and the baby were doing well together, but sadly, Darcy miscarried. I was at home when it occurred since I work remotely. She screamed out in agony as she was preparing to go to work. I saw the blood while attempting to console her. She started sobbing right away, so I believe we both noticed it at the same moment. I immediately dialed 911 in a panic. The physicians at the hospital informed us that she had miscarried. They suggested she was probably overworking herself. For us both, it was a difficult and depressing period. However, I promised her that we would eventually have more children, even though we never did, and she eventually appeared to return to her typical self. After that, I did all in my power to ease her burden. I relocated us into a larger apartment and got her a new automobile. To support her with her work, I even paid to have a professional website created for her, which I developed myself. In order to reduce her burden, I also helped pay for her assistance. We seemed to be back on course for a time. Once more, everything was going smoothly. In retrospect, I sincerely appreciate that we were able to avoid having children throughout our marriage. I realize it sounds awful, particularly in light of the fact that she miscarried, but it seems like it would have made things much more difficult. I would have been far too connected if we had a child, and it would have prevented me from doing what I ultimately had to do. Everything would have been different if I hadn't wished to harm my child's mother. For the sake of this article, I will divulge a personal detail. I get angry easily. That's how I've always been, and Darcy knew it from the beginning. No, the issues that subsequently arose had nothing to do with my temper. The fact that she wanted me to feel powerless was the true problem. It was no longer about cooperation or compromise. Things began to fall apart because she just needed to make her independence known in a way that seemed like she was attempting to prove something. At first, nothing too crazy. Every time we got into a fight, though, Darcy started packing her things and heading off to stay with her relatives. I thought I must have made a big mistake the first time this behavior occurred because it was new. I believed that perhaps I had pushed her too far because she had never done anything like that before. Naturally, I apologized over the phone and essentially pleaded with her to return home. She also did. The fact that her family didn't attempt to send her back, call to mediate, or even inquire as to what had transpired, however, should have disturbed me at the time in retrospect. They seemed to be fine with her simply walking out. However, it made some sense because they didn't like me. Unexpectedly, it occurred once more. It was worse this time. In fact, I received a call from her siblings berating me for mistreating their sister. They claimed that her miscarriage was due to me. That was a really painful part. They gave the impression that her sister was bound up with me, a worthless man. I wasn't even considering getting a divorce at this time since I was still in love. I assumed that, as usual, we would figure it out, She pushed me so hard during one of our confrontations that I locked her out of the house for the first time. I simply couldn't handle it any longer. She fled off to her family once more, of course, but they went one step farther this time. To give the impression that I had mistreated her, they took her to the police. The entire situation descended into chaos. Before I knew it, we were attending marriage therapy after my parents had to intervene. The irony is that it seemed to work. Things halted throughout the packing and departure process, and her relatives also ceased meddling in our affairs. After 5 years of marriage, we began to feel as though our relationship was returning to its pre-dating state. However, I ought to have exercised greater caution. I should have been cautious of someone who could let the false story that I was an abuser to spread among her family and the police, even if they rejected the claims. However, love has a way of impairing judgment, as I have shown. I thus like going out and working from various locations occasionally. I would pick a spot in advance, eat something, and perhaps take in some of the sights. Simply anything that isn't the norm. I saw her during one of these excursions. I must be wrong, I told myself. I assumed it was someone who resembled her in appearance or attire. Something didn't set right with my intellect as it tried to make sense of it. I decided to follow her. I was aware that she rented an office for her job, but it was far from my current location. Furthermore, I had no idea she had any activities planned or that she was seeing anyone here. She met up with a man I had never seen before when I followed her to a restaurant. Even though she seemed completely happy with him, I still needed to keep an eye on her. Wearing a baseball cap, I entered the restaurant in the hopes of being unnoticed, placed an order for a drink, and then sat back to observe them. I lingered long enough to watch her bid farewell. However, the man remained behind. I decided to attempt to elicit some information from him at this point. I stated to him, he got a beautiful woman, and to my complete amazement, he replied, "Yeah, she's my girlfriend." I lost my train of thought. He murmured something else, but I was too astonished to hear it. I simply found myself leaving. Everything after that was a blur, including how I got to my car and drove home. After returning home, I showered, drank too much wine, and fell asleep until Darcy woke me up for supper. She didn't mention meeting anyone when I inquired how her day went. The days that followed were difficult. I kept thinking about what I had witnessed. I realized I needed to learn more about this man. I looked at her phone. Lately, she had been guarding it. However, I have a method for accessing her phone. I saw that she frequently called someone named Diego. I thus noted the number, looked up that name on her social media profiles, emailed the handles to my phone, and included screenshots of their chats. I discovered that he was sharing photos of himself on vacation, in fancy automobiles, and leading what appeared to be an opulent lifestyle on social media. However, something wasn't quite right. I realized I needed assistance at this time. I thus provided an IT colleague with his phone number and social media accounts, who was interested in cybersecurity. I instructed him to find out as much as he could about this man. What he discovered was fascinating. Diego was dishonest. He had an extensive history of defrauding women, living off their money, and fabricating a false persona as a successful businessman. He was able to con more women with ease because to that image. In a Twitter thread that called him out and warned other ladies to be wary, one of the older pictures he had on his Facebook profile was shared. Even if Diego was his true name was uncertain. She was therefore not only unfaithful to me, but also unfaithful to a con artist. Making sure she got caught up in her own falsehoods was the greatest method for me to undermine her life from the inside out. I had to divert her attention from me first so I could work covertly. I pretended to be more aloof and preoccupied in order to quietly support her developing fixation with Diego. I complied whenever she expressed dissatisfaction or grumbled about me. At first, I even began to pretend that I was thinking about leaving. This increased her recklessness, ready to solidify her future with Diego, who, based on the screenshots I had, was giving her endless dreams about their ideal life together. Her family was also involved, so it wasn't just her. Diego represented wealth and what their family desired for their daughter. My friend dug considerably deeper into Diego's social media background this time. Diego was obviously involved in some dubious activities. He discovered that other complaints from ladies all around the nation were on old accounts that were connected to Diego's email address. These women were discussing how Diego defrauded them of funds for fictitious company ventures. There was no denying the pattern of the civil litigation they had brought. I needed an opener like this. I only needed to push Darcy a bit farther into his problem and wait for everything to fall apart. I didn't have to take him down myself. This is where strategy and patience were needed. As I mentioned, I began to act foolish. I acted aloof, as if I wasn't even aware of what Darcy was doing, and claimed that I was under stress from work. I stopped arguing with her. I hardly participated. She felt more justified in spending more time and, most crucially, more money on whatever it was that Diego was offering her as a result of this, which pushed her straight into his arms. I was the man she couldn't wait to get away from, and he was her new ideal existence. I made sure that Darcy was unaware of my knowledge of Diego at this time. She began investing alongside Diego. I had been spying virtually every day. Darcy began obtaining loans under her name. She believed that she was wise and that everything would work out since Diego's business would succeed. After several months, Darcy began to notice inconsistencies in Diego's tales. She started to inquire as to why he wasn't pressuring her to be married, why they weren't moving, or why her investments weren't yielding profits. Diego quickly performed his disappearance act. For weeks he avoided her, and when she attempted to find him, he was nowhere to be seen, most likely working on his next victim. The finest aspect? Her finances were nearly depleted by the time she recognized what had happened. She was unable to repay the loans she had taken out in order to give in. Fortunately, none of my funds were in the joint account. I'm not sure when it eventually dawned on her that all of her money was gone and Diego would never return. I just recall the day she approached me and said we needed to speak. She began to cry and tried to plead for my assistance when I listened to her. Told me everything that occurred with Diego, with the obvious exception of the cheating. You have tech-savvy buddies who may be able to hack or find information. Stop talking. Her narrative was quite poignant to someone who was unaware of the infidelity. But me? I refused to accept it. I dropped the bomb at that point. I had been keeping tabs on everything. I have printouts of her financial activities, screenshots of her texts to Diego, and a detailed chronology of when she began taking money out of our accounts. I handed her the divorce papers to sign as a crown. This woman went into a frenzy. She began yelling and flinging herself in all directions. I had to shake her by the shoulders at one point in an attempt to convince her to stop making such a mess. At that moment, the neighbors' attention would have undoubtedly been called. One of them calling the police and telling them that I had mistreated her was the last thing I needed. Then she knelt down and begged me. She began to behave irrationally, as if her mental state were about to crumble. To be honest, I was so worried that I had to ask her buddy to come over right away. She packed a few items and found out what had happened when her buddy arrived, eventually bringing Darcy along. Even if it had been frightening, I didn't forgive her because of it. A few days later, Darcy began phoning me. I told her that any information she wanted to provide me should go through my lawyer before blocking her when I could no longer stand the disruptions. She attempted to enter the house, but I warned her that I would call the police if she did so again. I started receiving calls from her relatives after that, so I assumed she returned home. But I blocked those as well. She and her family refused to engage in calm negotiations, so we had to go to court. It was challenging since, at the time of the case, it didn't seem like I would benefit from the separation. Fortunately for me, however, karma was at work as the divorce process came to a finish. First of all, custody wasn't a problem because thank God we didn't have children. But things became complicated on the financial side. In a divorce, marital assets are distributed fairly in the majority of states, including mine. That doesn't always imply 50/50 rather. It means what's reasonable in the given situation. I was aware that Darcy had begun by transferring funds from our joint account, and that she eventually advanced to transferring her own funds into Diego's fictitious business endeavors since she didn't want me to suspect anything. I took care to provide all the documentation of her expenditures during our marriage, demonstrating how she had carelessly mishandled even her own funds, leaving her in debt. That shouldn't have to be my suffering. We discussed everything with the excellent and pricey lawyer I had engaged. The money she transferred to Diego, the debts she took out in her name, and her general lack of financial responsibility. The judge showed no pity for her financial difficulties. They really decided that she was entirely liable for her own bills. She attempted to claim that Diego had deceived her, but the court ignored her. It was a divorce, not a criminal case. Furthermore, the division of assets and debts was the sole factor that mattered in a divorce court. I got away clean because of my lawyer's skill. No debt division, no spousal support, nothing. However, Darcy was left to clean up the mess she had made. She was left with nothing but a mountain of debt and a damaged credit score when the judge ordered her to pay back the loans she had taken out on her own, depleting her personal funds. Not me, and not Diego. The highlight of it all: I was able to get my retribution without engaging in any illicit or dubious activities. Everything was done by the book. I just made sure she couldn't crawl out of the grave after letting her dig it herself. She was legally unable to change her bad choices. Furthermore, she was powerless to change it. She made far too many attempts to get in touch after the divorce, presumably believing she could use new numbers and methods to sweet-talk her way back into my favor. She would use a different account or phone number to contact me after I blocked her. I'll be requesting a restraining order because of her persistent harassment, and I'm confident that I'll be granted it. She's breaking the order if she tries to get in touch with me, or shows up without warning, which will give her a whole new legal problem. That's how I dealt with it, anyhow. It was systematic, planned, and lawful. It was neither theatrical nor violent. I can now finally go on with my life since I let Darcy to be destroyed by her own acts. She's still running after a long-gone guy and drowning in debt. And me? Simply said, I'm doing well. I'm prepared to finally move on from this. Therefore, Hollywood-style retaliation isn't necessarily the solution if you ever find yourself in a similar circumstance to mine. Simply be astute, keep thorough records, and delegate the burden to the legal system. Instead of giving in to drama or rage, your calculated way to addressing the problem demonstrates a degree of maturity that not everyone possesses. I'm jealous of your restraint. Furthermore, in order to preserve your serenity and guarantee that you may go on without the continual reminders of the past, you must apply for a restraining order. I hope that gives you the perspective and room you need to concentrate on your future. As you begin this new chapter, keep in mind how important it is to put your own health first. Spend some time rediscovering your sources of fulfillment and happiness. You deserve to rediscover happiness and create a life free from the weight of the past. Whether that means taking up new hobbies, hanging out with friends, or simply taking some time to think. Cheers to new beginnings. Please share your opinions in the comments section below. We also appreciate your presence on our space today. To ensure you don't miss our next video, please press the notification bell, like, and subscribe. Till the next occasion.